June 9, 1982. Syria scrambled 80 MiG fighters to defend their homeland. By sunset, 82 would never return. Israel lost 0. This wasn't just an air battle. This was the afternoon the Soviet Union discovered their military technology was obsolete, and the shockwave from those few hours would help bring down an empire 9 years later. What you're about to hear remained classified for 20 years. The Israelis called it Operation Mole Cricket 19. The Soviets called it something else entirely. By June 1982, Lebanon had become a powder keg. The Palestine Liberation Organization operated from Beirut with impunity. Israel's northern border bled from rocket attacks. But this story isn't about ground warfare. It's about what waited in the Bekaa Valley. Syria had deployed 19 surface-to-air missile batteries across the Bekaa Valley, Soviet SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 systems, the same technology that had bloodied American air power over Vietnam. These weren't just defensive weapons. They created an aerial fortress protecting Syrian air superiority. The Israeli Air Force had tried probing these defenses weeks earlier. They'd lost aircraft. Pilots had died. The Soviet systems worked exactly as advertised. So the question wasn't whether Israel would confront this threat. It was how they'd do it without losing dozens of jets and pilots in the process. Here's what most histories leave out. Israel wasn't fighting this battle alone. They had something the Soviets never anticipated: complete access to American early warning technology, electronic warfare capabilities, and real-time coordination systems, E-2C Hawkeye AWACS aircraft, flying command centers, advanced jamming pods that could blind radar systems, most critically, anti-radiation missiles that could home in on active radar emissions. As one Israeli commander later stated, the operation demonstrated not just tactical superiority, but a fundamental gap in how the West and East approached integrated air warfare. But technology alone doesn't win battles. What Israel was about to attempt had never been tried before. A synchronized, multi-layered assault combining drones, electronic warfare, anti-radar missiles, and fighter aircraft in a single coordinated strike. If it failed, the casualty count would be catastrophic. June 6, 1982. Israel launched its invasion of Lebanon, Operation Peace for Galilee. The official objective was to push the PLO back 40 kilometers from the border, but Israeli military planners knew the real test would come when Syria inevitably intervened. Ground forces advanced. Syrian forces began mobilizing. Syrian MiG-21s and MiG-23s started flying combat air patrol over the Bekaa. The SA-6 missile batteries went to full alert status. Israeli reconnaissance confirmed what everyone expected. The Syrians were preparing for a massive air confrontation. By June 8th, Syrian and Israeli aircraft had already clashed in limited engagements. Syrian surface-to-air missiles had forced Israeli jets to break off attacks. The message from Damascus was clear. The Bekaa Valley was a no-fly zone for Israeli aircraft. What Syria didn't know, what the Soviet advisors manning those radar stations couldn't possibly know, was that for 3 days, Israeli drones had been crisscrossing the valley, invisible to Syrian radar operators, mapping every frequency, every radar pulse, every communication channel. The Israelis weren't avoiding the Bekaa Valley. They were studying it. And on June the 9th, at precisely 2:00 p.m., they would demonstrate what they'd learned. 1400 hours, June the 9th, 1982. Syrian radar operators in the Bekaa Valley suddenly detected multiple airborne contacts approaching from the west. Slow-moving, low altitude. The radar signatures looked like Israeli aircraft. They weren't. Israeli Mastiff and Scout drones, unmanned decoys. Their purpose was simple: force Syrian SAM batteries to activate their radar systems. The moment those radars powered up, they became targets. Here's the brilliance. The Syrians had a choice: ignore the contacts and potentially let Israeli aircraft through, or activate their missile systems and reveal their exact positions and radar frequencies. Syrian doctrine, trained by Soviet advisors, dictated one response: engage all airborne threats. The Syrians made the expected choice. Dozens of SA-6 missiles streaked toward the drones. Some hit their targets. Most didn't. These weren't multi-million-dollar fighters, but relatively cheap unmanned aircraft. But something else happened in those first minutes. Something the Syrian crews never saw coming. The moment Syrian radar operators achieved missile lock, Israeli electronic warfare aircraft activated their systems. Boeing 707s converted into flying jamming stations. Simultaneously, American-supplied AGM-45 Shrike and AGM-78 standard anti-radiation missiles began raining down on active radar sites. Syrian radar screens dissolved into static. Communication channels filled with interference. Anti-radiation missiles homed in on the electromagnetic emissions from active SA-6 systems. Syrian missile crews found themselves blind, deaf, and under direct attack. In the first 90 minutes of the operation, 17 of 19 Syrian SAM batteries were destroyed or damaged beyond operational capability. The Soviets had spent years building this integrated air defense network. Israel dismantled it in less time than a commercial flight from Tel Aviv to Paris. Imagine being a Syrian radar operator in those moments. You've trained on Soviet equipment for years. You know the doctrine. You do everything correctly. And suddenly your screen goes white with jamming, your communications are dead, and missiles are impacting around your position. You're fighting blind against an enemy that can see everything. But the destruction of the SAM batteries was just the opening act. Because now, with Syrian air defenses crippled, the Bekaa Valley airspace was about to become a killing field. With their surface-to-air missile shield obliterated, Syria had one option left: launch every available fighter aircraft. What followed would be remembered as one of the most lopsided air battles in modern warfare. Syrian Air Force scrambled MiG-21 and MiG-23 fighters. Israeli F-15 Eagles and F-16 Fighting Falcons were already airborne in combat air patrol. E-2C Hawkeye AWACS coordinated Israeli fighters with real-time intelligence. Syrian fighters arrived over the Bekaa Valley without ground-controlled intercept guidance. Here's what made this a massacre rather than a battle. Syrian pilots were trained to rely on ground controllers to vector them toward enemy aircraft. Soviet doctrine emphasized centralized control. Ground radar stations told pilots where to fly, when to engage, when to disengage. Israeli jamming had severed that connection completely. One Israeli pilot later described watching a group of Syrian MiGs flying figure-eights over the valley. They just flew around and obviously had no idea what to do next. Without ground control, without radar guidance, Syrian pilots were essentially flying blind into an arena where Israeli pilots had complete situational awareness. By sunset on June 9th, 29 Syrian MiGs confirmed destroyed. Israeli losses were 0, 29-0. In any other context, those numbers would seem impossible. But June 9th was just the beginning, because the Syrian Air Force, disbelieving their losses, would try again the next morning. June 10, 1982. Damascus ordered another massive scramble. Syrian commanders believed the previous day's losses were anomalous. Bad luck, perhaps a few tactical mistakes. They were wrong. Syrian Air Force launched even more fighters. Israeli tactics remained unchanged. E-2C coordination, complete air superiority, no ground-based threats. Syrian pilots still operated without effective ground control. The result was 35 additional Syrian aircraft destroyed. 64 Syrian fighters destroyed in 2 days. Israeli Air Force losses remained at 0. This wasn't about pilot skill alone, though Israeli pilots were superbly trained. This was about systems integration. The Israelis fought as a networked force. Every aircraft, every radar system, every jamming platform connected and coordinated. The Syrians fought as individual units, each isolated and vulnerable. By June 11th, the Syrian Air Force effectively ceased offensive operations. They'd lost not just aircraft, but the institutional confidence that makes an air force effective. But the final accounting of Operation Mole Cricket 19 would prove even more devastating than those 2 days suggest. When military historians compiled the final records of the 1982 Lebanon War air campaign, the numbers defied belief. Total Syrian aircraft losses ranged between 82 and 88, depending on the source. Total Israeli F-15 and F-16 losses in air-to-air combat remained at 0. Syrian SAM batteries destroyed numbered 17 of 19. Duration of SAM suppression was approximately 2 hours. Multiple Israeli pilots achieved ACE status, meaning 5 or more kills, during this operation alone, 82 to nothing. Even accounting for technological advantages, even acknowledging American support, even considering superior training, these numbers represent something unprecedented in modern air warfare. But here's the question that haunted Moscow. If Soviet equipment and Soviet doctrine could be defeated this decisively, what did that mean for the Cold War balance of power? The Soviet military newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda faced an impossible task. Explain how Soviet-equipped and Soviet-trained forces had suffered catastrophic defeat without admitting Soviet military doctrine was fundamentally flawed. Krasnaya Zvezda published claims that 67 Israeli aircraft, including multiple F-15s and F-16s, had been shot down during the Bekaa Valley fighting. Complete fabrication. Not a single verifiable Israeli combat loss could be documented. This wasn't just propaganda for domestic consumption. Soviet military exports were a cornerstone of their geopolitical influence. Nations bought Soviet weapons because they believed they worked. The Bekaa Valley demonstrated otherwise. So Moscow did what authoritarian regimes do when confronted with inconvenient reality. They invented a different reality. But propaganda couldn't conceal the truth from the people who mattered most. Soviet military leadership. Behind the Kremlin walls, a very different conversation was taking place. Years after the Cold War ended, former Israeli Air Force commander David Ivry revealed a conversation he'd had in 1982 with a Czechoslovak general visiting Moscow. The general told Ivry something remarkable. The general said that Soviet military leadership understood what had happened in the Bekaa Valley. They recognized that Western technology, American sensors, American electronic warfare, American coordination systems had achieved decisive superiority over Soviet equipment. And that realization, he claimed, began to fundamentally alter Soviet strategic thinking. Operation Mole Cricket 19 exposed several fatal flaws in Soviet military doctrine. Over-centralized command and control that collapsed when communications were disrupted. Radar and SAM systems vulnerable to electronic countermeasures. Fighter aircraft doctrine that couldn't adapt when ground control was severed. Fundamentally, an approach to warfare that assumed technology parity with the West. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he faced an impossible economic reality. The Soviet Union could not match Western military technology without bankrupting itself. The arms race was already lost. The Bekaa Valley hadn't caused that reality, but it had made it undeniable. One Czech general's assessment to Ivry suggested the operation contributed to Soviet recognition, that reform, glasnost, perestroika, was necessary because military competition with the West was unsustainable. 82 Syrian aircraft destroyed in an afternoon, 17 SAM batteries eliminated in 2 hours. But the real casualty of Operation Mole Cricket 19 might have been the Soviet Union's confidence that it could compete militarily with the West. And confidence in a superpower confrontation is everything. Behind the statistics were men in cockpits, Israeli pilots who trained for years for this exact scenario, and Syrian pilots who found themselves in a nightmare they couldn't comprehend. Israeli F-15 and F-16 pilots described almost surreal combat experiences. With complete radar coverage from the E-2C Hawkeye, they knew where every Syrian aircraft was before engaging. They could choose their targets, their approach angles, their moment of attack. One pilot compared it to hunting with night vision goggles against opponents stumbling in the dark. Israeli pilots flew 40+ hours per month, practiced against aggressor squadrons using Soviet tactics, and trained in realistic combat scenarios. Syrian pilots, constrained by fuel costs and Soviet training doctrine, flew a fraction of those hours and practiced primarily set-piece intercepts guided by ground control. But statistics and training advantages don't capture what it means to be in a cockpit when missiles are flying. What did it feel like to be a Syrian pilot, alone in the sky, unable to contact your controllers, watching your wingman explode? Syrian pilots weren't cowards. They flew into battle knowing Israeli aircraft were waiting. They'd lost comrades the day before. They launched anyway. Imagine this. You're flying a MiG-23 at 600 miles per hour. Your radio is filled with static, Israeli jamming. Your ground controllers can't vector you toward targets. Your radar warning receiver is screaming. Multiple Israeli fighters have locked onto you. You're trying to find targets visually while evading missiles from threats you can't see on your instruments. Soviet doctrine had trained Syrian pilots to be components in an integrated system. When that system was dismantled through electronic warfare, the training that should have saved them became a liability. They'd learned to rely on external guidance. When it disappeared, they had no fallback doctrine. 82 airmen died in those 2 days. Most were young men following orders, flying into a battle their commanders assured them they could win. The failure wasn't theirs. It was the system's. The Bekaa Valley turkey shoot wasn't primarily about pilot skill. It was about a fundamental shift in how wars are fought. By 1982, air warfare had evolved beyond dogfighting. It had become about sensors, data links, electronic warfare, and system integration. The side with better information, who could see more, communicate faster, coordinate more effectively, possessed insurmountable advantage. American military technology in the 1980s reflected a decade of post-Vietnam innovation. AWACS aircraft providing complete battlefield awareness. Data links allowing real-time information sharing between aircraft. Advanced electronic warfare capabilities. Beyond visual range missiles. Integrated air defense suppression doctrine. Soviet military technology, by contrast, remained rooted in 1960s and 1970s concepts. Centralized control, limited pilot initiative, systems designed to work in isolation rather than as integrated networks. The Bekaa Valley didn't just demonstrate Israeli tactical brilliance or American technological superiority. It revealed that modern warfare had fundamentally changed and only one side had adapted. The immediate military consequences of Operation Mole Cricket 19 were straightforward. Israel achieved complete air superiority for the remainder of the Lebanon War. Syrian forces could not effectively resist without air cover. The PLO, the original target of the invasion, found itself without its primary protector. Syria effectively withdrew from direct confrontation with Israeli forces. Syrian Air Force required years to rebuild capability and confidence. Soviet prestige as arms supplier was damaged throughout the Middle East. Other Soviet client states began questioning the reliability of Soviet equipment. Israel shared detailed battle damage assessment and electronic intelligence with the United States. American military planners gained unprecedented insight into Soviet SAM systems, radar capabilities, and fighter aircraft performance. Intelligence that would prove invaluable if Cold War tensions ever escalated to direct conflict. But the deepest impact of June 9, 1982, wouldn't be measured in destroyed aircraft or captured territory. It would be measured in perception. Specifically, Moscow's perception of its own military vulnerability. By 1982, the Soviet Union was already straining under the economic burden of military competition with the West. Afghanistan had become the USSR's Vietnam, an unwinnable counterinsurgency draining resources and morale. The nuclear arms race consumed vast percentages of Soviet GDP. And now, the Bekaa Valley suggested that even without nuclear weapons, Soviet conventional forces might not match Western capabilities. The United States spent approximately 6% of its GDP on defense in the early 1980s. The Soviet Union spent an estimated 15 to 20% of its GDP, a proportion that was slowly strangling economic development and civilian living standards. The Bekaa Valley revealed a deeper problem. The Soviet Union couldn't simply build more MiGs or deploy more SAM batteries. The technological gap was qualitative, not quantitative. Closing it would require fundamental reforms in Soviet military research, manufacturing, and doctrine. Reforms that would cost tens of billions of rubles the USSR didn't have. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, he inherited this reality. His reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika, were partly driven by recognition that the USSR could not sustain military competition with the West indefinitely. Did Operation Mole Cricket 19 directly cause the collapse of the Soviet Union? No. But it contributed to a growing recognition within Soviet leadership that the Cold War was unwinnable on current terms. The lessons of Operation Mole Cricket 19 reshaped military thinking worldwide. After 1982, air forces globally recognized several critical realities. Integrated air defense systems must be resilient to electronic attack. Fighter pilots require training to operate independently when centralized control is disrupted. Information dominance, knowing where enemy forces are and denying them the same knowledge, is decisive. Unmanned systems can serve as force multipliers and expendable reconnaissance assets. When the United States launched Operation Desert Storm in 1991, the air campaign bore unmistakable similarities to Mole Cricket 19. Opening strikes targeted Iraqi air defense radars and SAM sites. Electronic warfare aircraft jammed Iraqi communications. AWACS provided coalition aircraft with complete battlefield awareness. Iraqi fighters, when they engaged, were systematically destroyed. In the 21st century, similar dynamics play out in conflicts worldwide. Drone warfare, cyber operations, electronic warfare. All reflect the lesson Israel taught in 1982. In modern conflict, the side that can see while blinding their opponent possesses overwhelming advantage. But technology doesn't eliminate human factors. Courage, training, leadership, and moral clarity still matter. Israeli pilots flew into hostile airspace knowing they might not return. Syrian pilots did the same. The difference wasn't bravery, it was preparation, doctrine, and the systems supporting them. 41 years after 82 Syrian aircraft fell from the skies over Lebanon, the core lesson remains. Wars are won not just by weapons, but by the systems that employ them, and the minds that design those systems. June 9, 1982, began as an ordinary summer day in the Bekaa Valley. By evening, modern air warfare had been redefined. 82 Syrian aircraft destroyed. 0 Israeli losses in air-to-air combat. 17 of 19 SAM batteries eliminated. 2 hours to dismantle what took years to build. But the real story isn't about kill ratios or technological superiority. It's about the moment when one superpower realized it could not match its rival. When the Soviet Union understood that military competition with the West was unsustainable. Operation Mole Cricket 19 didn't end the Cold War. That would take 9 more years, a Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, economic reforms that came too late, and ultimately the dissolution of the USSR in 1991. But on that June afternoon in 1982, the trajectory became clearer to those paying attention. The pilots who fought that day, Israeli and Syrian alike, were men doing their duty as they understood it. Some went home. 82 never did. Their story deserves remembering, not for triumphalism, but for understanding. In war, there are no perfect victories, only degrees of tragedy. June the 9th, 1982, was decisive. It was historic. It changed military doctrine and arguably accelerated the end of the Cold War. But it was still a day when 82 families lost sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. That's the cost of the afternoon that changed everything. 80 MiGs sent to defend their homeland. 82 that never came back. 0 losses.